The sun was crawling down the wide, red horizon when Hank Murdoch finally pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of his ranch. Dust clung to his boots, his hat, his skin, weeks of hard riding and cattle work etched into every line of his face. The sky burned orange and gold, and the air smelled like dry grass and old leather. For a man like Hank, the open plains were freedom, but tonight, freedom felt heavier than usual. He dismounted slowly, patting his horse's neck before leading it toward the corral. The animal snorted, tired but loyal. "Good boy," Hank muttered, his deep voice gravelly from days without much talkin'. "We're home. Home." The word didn't feel the same anymore. Not since she'd arrived. The old ranch house sat quietly at the edge of the property, its wood worn silver from the wind. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady, patient, alive. That meant Eliza was still awake. His pulse ticked faster at the thought. She'd come 3 weeks ago on the eastbound train, stepping off with nothing but a small leather trunk and a letter that said she was to be his bride. The marriage arrangement had been brokered through the mail. Lonely ranchers out west needed wives, and women back east needed a way out. A transaction, that's what everyone called it. But Hank had never been comfortable with the word. He hadn't wanted to buy anyone. He just wanted someone to share the silence with. Someone to talk to when the prairie nights got too long. Someone to care for this place the way he did. But Eliza, she wasn't what he'd expected. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the gentle, quiet way he'd imagined. She had eyes like wild green fire, a mouth that could cut like a blade, and a spine straight as a fence post. She'd fought him with words from the very first day, challenging every unspoken rule. She'd cook, but on her terms. She'd help with chores, but not because he demanded it. She wasn't a servant, and she made sure he knew it. Still, there was something about her that made his chest tighten whenever she was near. He pushed open the door. The hinges creaked, and warmth spilled out, orange firelight flickering against the wooden walls. The scent of stew lingered faintly in the air, though the pot on the stove had gone cold. She was there, sitting by the fire in his old flannel shirt, her knees drawn close, hair falling loose over her shoulders. The sight made his breath catch. She wasn't looking at him, but at the flames, lost in thought. Her bare feet brushed the rug lightly, her face unreadable. "Eliza," he said quietly, taking off his hat. Her head turned slowly, and for a moment the firelight danced in her eyes. She looked tired, but not weak, never weak. There was something steeled behind her calm expression. "You're late," she said softly. "Cattle drive took longer than I planned." He hesitated, shifting his weight. "You all right?" Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Am I all right?" she repeated, voice tinged with bitterness. "You tell me, Mr. Murdoch. You paid for me. Doesn't that make me your concern?" Hank froze. The words hit harder than any punch he'd taken in his life. "I didn't," he started, but she cut him off, rising from her seat. "You didn't what? Mean to?" she asked, stepping closer. "You sent for me like you'd order a saddle. And now I'm here, halfway across the country, tied to a man who barely speaks, living on land that don't know kindness." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from something far deeper. "Hurt, Eliza." She took another step toward him, her eyes fierce, her hands clenched at her sides. "You've paid for me," she said, low and shaking. "Just do it." The room fell silent. The fire cracked. Outside, a coyote cried in the distance. Hank's breath caught. He'd fought outlaws, faced stampedes, but this was something else entirely. He didn't move. Couldn't. "What are you sayin'?" he finally managed, his voice rough. Her jaw set, though her lower lip quivered. "You wanted a wife. You bought one. So stop pretendin', you're some kind of saint and just take what you paid for." The firelight glowed against her flushed skin, and Hank's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was wrong, that he never wanted her like that, but his tongue felt heavy. He saw the pain behind her eyes, the pride holding her together. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "I didn't bring you here to own you, Eliza." She looked at him then, startled for a moment. The anger flickered, replaced by something uncertain, fragile. But before either could say more, thunder rumbled far out over the plains, echoing through the ranch like a warning. And in that moment, standing across the fire, the distance between them thick with words unspoken, Hank realized this woman wasn't a purchase. She was a storm. And he'd have to decide whether to weather it, or be swept away. The wind outside beat against the ranch house, rattling the shutters and moaning through the cracks in the wood. It was as if the prairie itself could feel the tension that hung in the air. Hank stood there by the fire, one hand still on the back of the chair he'd meant to sit in, but the thought of sitting now felt wrong. Eliza's words had burned the ground beneath him. "You've paid for me. Just do it." She stood across from him, chin lifted, defiant as ever, though he could see the shimmer of fear and pride mixed behind her eyes. She wasn't bluffing, not this time. That was the hardest part. "Eliza," he said quietly, the sound of his name on his own tongue feeling strange. "You really think I brought you here just to?" She interrupted him sharply. "What else was I supposed to think? Men like you don't send for wives out of charity, Hank Murdoch. They send for what they can't find in town: obedience, comfort, maybe a body that doesn't argue." Her voice wavered at the end, but her gaze didn't. She looked at him as though daring him to prove her wrong. Hank let out a long breath, the kind that came from a place of tiredness too deep to explain. He took off his hat and tossed it on the table. "You got a mean streak in you," he said finally. "Ain't no man ever told you that." She didn't answer. The fire popped, filling the silence between them. He stepped closer. Slowly. Carefully. Not like a man approaching prey, but like someone walking into a storm with his hands open. "I didn't pay for you, Eliza. I paid for a chance. Maybe a foolish one." Her brow furrowed. A chance for what? For something real. That made her blink. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. For a heartbeat, she didn't look angry anymore, just lost. Hank moved closer until he was just a few feet away. The light from the fire carved lines across his face, showing every scar, every rough year carved into him by wind, dust, and loneliness. His voice softened, carrying that kind of honesty a man could only speak once. "I don't need a servant. I don't need someone to bow when I walk by. He stopped himself and shook his head. "Hell, I don't even know what I need anymore." Her voice was softer when she replied. "Then why did you write for me?" "Because I got tired of hearing the wind is my only company," he said simply. "Because every time the sun went down, this house got bigger and emptier. And because maybe I thought someone like you might fill the silence." She stared at him. The anger was draining away now, leaving something raw and trembling in its place. The fire crackled again. A single tear of wax rolled down the side of the half-melted candle on the mantel. Hank bent one knee, lowering himself until his rough, work-worn hands rested gently on his thighs. His voice dropped low, but steady. "You said I paid for you. That might be true by paper, but that don't mean I own you. I could never force what ain't freely given. That ain't love. That ain't decency." Eliza's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked away, blinking fast. The tension that had coiled in her shoulders began to shake loose, replaced by a fragile sort of disbelief. "You'd wait," she said, her voice breaking a little. "Even if I never." "I'd wait," he interrupted softly. "As long as it takes." Her hands trembled, and she quickly crossed her arms, as if to hide it. "You're a strange man, Hank Murdoch." "Maybe," he said with a faint smile. "But at least I ain't a cruel one." She gave a short, unsteady laugh, the first sound of warmth between them since she'd arrived at the ranch. It was brief, but enough to shift the air. After a long pause, she whispered, "You could have fooled me that night at the train station. You barely said 2 words to me." He chuckled quietly. "Was afraid if I said too much, you'd change your mind and get back on that train." She looked down, hiding the flicker of a smile. "Maybe I should've." "Maybe," he agreed. "But you didn't." They stood in silence again, the storm outside beginning to quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, the coyotes had gone still, as if listening. Finally, Eliza stepped closer. "You think I'm trouble, don't you?" He looked straight into her eyes. "Darlin', you're the kind of trouble a man spends his whole life looking for." Her breath caught, not because of his words, but because of the way he said them, calm, sure, without any demand behind them. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "You're my husband, Hank." He nodded. "Only if you'll have me as that, not because of some paper, but because you want to." She looked at him for a long moment, firelight flickering in her eyes, and said quietly, "Then maybe I'll decide that for myself." And for the first time since she'd arrived, Hank smiled, not the polite kind, but a real one, the kind that came from deep inside. Outside, the storm passed over the plains, leaving the night calm once again. Inside, two hearts that had come together by circumstance began, just barely, to beat in rhythm. The next morning dawned cool and quiet, the kind of rare morning on the plains when the world seemed to pause before the sun rose high enough to burn everything gold. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind the sweet smell of wet earth and sagebrush. Hank Murdoch was already outside, sleeves rolled up, mending a broken section of fence that the wind had torn loose. His movements were slow, thoughtful, each hammer strike echoing across the silent ranch like the steady beat of his heart. He hadn't slept much, not after what had passed between him and Eliza the night before. Her words, soft, trembling, full of something new, had settled deep in his chest. There was no anger in them this time. No fire. Just truth. And maybe hope. He bent down, checking the post alignment when he heard footsteps crunching softly on the damp ground. He didn't have to turn around to know it was her. Somehow, he already knew the sound of her walk, the steady rhythm, the pause before each step, like someone still learning to belong. "Mornin'," she said behind him, her voice quiet but clear. Hank straightened, brushing dust from his hands before turning. Eliza stood there in a pale cotton dress, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth, his spare gloves too big for her hands. The sunlight caught on her face, and for the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked determined. "Didn't expect to see you out here this early," he said, smiling faintly. She walked closer, eyes steady on his. "You said this ranch needs 2 sets of hands, didn't you?" He blinked, then chuckled softly. "That I did. Then I suppose it's time I start earnin' my place." He nodded, watching her pull the gloves tight. Without another word, she picked up a coil of wire and held the post for him. They worked side by side in silence, Hank driving nails, Eliza holding steady, both falling into a rhythm that felt more natural than either expected. Every so often their eyes met, and neither looked away as quickly as they used to. When the sun climbed higher, he paused and wiped the sweat from his brow. "You're a quick learner," he said. She smiled faintly, her cheeks flushed. "I've had to be. The world doesn't go easy on women who can't keep up." "No," he said, glancing at her. "It surely doesn't." For a while, they worked again, the only sounds the creak of wood, the soft clink of metal, and the cry of hawks overhead. Then, out of nowhere, Eliza spoke again, quieter this time. "You meant what you said last night." Hank froze, hammer still in hand. He didn't look up. "Every word. You'd really wait for me. No matter how long." He turned to her, meeting her eyes. "I've spent most of my life waitin', for rain, for luck, for peace. Waitin' for you ain't the hardest thing I've done." Her throat tightened, and she looked away, pretending to adjust the post. "You make it sound easy." He smiled gently. "Ain't nothin' easy about it, Eliza. But some things are worth the trouble." The words hung between them like a promise. The wind brushed past, carrying the scent of grass and the distant sound of cattle. By noon, the fence was mended, the tools put away. Hank leaned against the post, wiping his hands on his shirt. Eliza stood beside him, watching the horizon. It stretched endlessly before them, golden and wild. "Back east," she said quietly, "I used to dream about places like this. I thought it'd be peaceful. I didn't realize peace could be so lonely." Hank looked out too. "Lonely's a kind of quiet that can eat you alive. But it don't last forever. Not if you find someone who don't mind fillin' it with you." She turned to him, her eyes softening. "You think I could be that someone?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, slow enough for her to see every move, giving her every chance to stop him. When she didn't, he reached up and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't think, Eliza," he murmured. "I know." Her breath caught. She looked up at him, searching his face for doubt, for insincerity, but there was none. Only honesty. Only him. She swallowed hard. "You said you'd wait until I wanted you to." "I did," he said softly. "And I meant it." She hesitated, her lips trembling. "Then stop waitin'." The words were barely a whisper, but they struck him harder than any shout could. Without hesitation, Hank dropped the hammer he'd been holding and closed the distance between them. His hands, rough from work and weather, found her face gently. He kissed her, not with urgency or ownership, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd finally found what he'd been searching for. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest, her voice breaking in a half laugh, half sigh. "You've paid for me," she whispered again, softer this time, almost tender. "But now, you've earned me." He smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as the wind swept across the plains, cool and forgiving. "Reckon that's the first thing I've truly earned in a long while." The day stretched ahead, golden and full of promise. For the first time, the silence around the ranch didn't feel empty, it felt alive. As the sun dipped once more toward the horizon, painting the sky in fire and honey, Hank looked at the woman beside him and realized that in the heart of this wild, untamed land, he hadn't just built a home. He'd found one.